So there was a big Supreme Court case coming up, and I don't know if you guys have heard about this. I feel like this is actually pretty massive, and unfortunately being to a certain degree underreported. Here is the National Desk talking about this whole situation.
The Supreme Court is taking up a case that could eliminate some charges against former President Trump and hundreds of other people involved in January 6th. I'm with Courtney from the Fact Check team, and the court started hearing arguments earlier today, and a decision isn't expected for months, but it's already having an impact on some.
That's right, Didi. Over the last several weeks, federal judges in Washington have agreed to release around 10 defendants who are serving prison sentences because of the obstruction law, since the court is determining whether the law should have been used in the first place.
How significant is this decision going to be?
That's a good question. To put things into perspective, according to the Justice Department, nearly 1,400 people have been charged in total. Out of those, just over 350 were charged with obstruction, and around 170 have been actually convicted. Many have had their sentencing delayed. So if the court did reverse the ruling, it wouldn't affect a majority of the defendants because they're also charged with other felony or misdemeanor crimes. That means there wouldn't be any cases that would be completely thrown out. Also, some judges have already signaled that they'd increase the sentences attached to other charges if the obstruction count is deemed invalid.
All right, Courtney, thank you. And for more on this Fact Check team topic, a lot to it, including links to their sources, of course.
Now, this is an interesting case because I don't think that the obstruction should have been brought up. Now, I could be wrong that maybe the people were there to obstruct justice. But the tricky thing to me with this with this entire situation is that it's not clear what the January 6th people were trying to do. Were they trying to take over the White House? I heard a conspiracy theory before that they were mad about the votes being counted, and so they wanted to bust in and hold everyone in the chamber hostage so that the Trump would end up getting all of the Electoral College votes that he needed in order to win. But I didn't hear any backing of that, and I do research on that now, and I can't find any sourcing for that information. It's so strange because this is something that is largely in the mainstream media considered to be an insurrection, but it turns out to be a conspiracy theory because there's no evidence really that there was an effort made to actually overthrow anything or anyone. From what I can tell, it's just a lot of mad, angry hillbillies who were salty that Trump had lost the election and they were throwing a temper tantrum. That's not an insurrection. That's a dumb, stupid protest. I'm glad that the Supreme Court is questioning this, but I hope that, when they examine this, they actually look for motive, because I think it actually would be helpful for them to have a clear, definitive definition where it's like, okay, this is why they were here. This was their plan. They had these blueprints. They were supposed to go here and here so they could affect this change and bring about this result. We don't have that right now. We just have a bunch of people pretending that they know why these people did what they did, and then excoriating them for that. The Supreme Court on Tuesday questioned whether federal prosecutors went too far in bringing obstruction charges against hundreds of participants in the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot. But it wasn't clear how the justices would rule in a case that also could affect the prosecution of former President Donald Trump, who faces the same charge for his efforts to overturn his election loss in 2020. And that's different, right? If they rule that Donald Trump was trying to usurp some sort of federal process, then by all means, bring up the obstruction charge. Donald Trump is different than the rioters and the protesters, though. So let's make that clear. The justices heard arguments over the charge of obstruction of an official proceeding in the case of Joseph Fisher, a former Pennsylvania police officer who has been indicted for his role in disrupting Congress's certification of Joe Biden's 2020 presidential election victory over Trump. Fisher is one of 330 people facing that charge, which stems from a law passed in the aftermath of the Enron financial scandal more than 2 decades ago to deal with the destruction of documents. Trump is facing 2 charges in a separate case brought by special counsel Jack Smith in Washington that could be knocked out with a favorable ruling from the nation's highest court. Next week, the justices will hear arguments over whether the former president and presumptive nominee for the 2024 Republican nomination has absolute immunity from prosecution in that case, a proposition that has so far been rejected by 2 lower courts. Smith has argued separately in the immunity case that the obstruction charges against Trump are valid no matter how the court decides Fisher's case. The first former U.S. president under indictment, Trump, is on trial on hush money charges in New York and also has been charged with election interference in Georgia and with mishandling classified documents in Florida. This is going to be a huge case, especially if they end up overturning this, because I think this means that some people who were on Capitol grounds might be freed, which if they were nonviolent and they were just there because they were there after the initial violence and they saw the gates and stuff open and they were like, oh, I guess we can go in, and they saw Capitol Police letting them in, then for those people, I could easily understand and justify letting them go. So if there are people like that being charged with obstruction alone, hopefully that means that they'll get freed. Unfortunately, I think a Republican is probably going to eventually end up pardoning too many of these people who got convicted or charged with crimes for being there on January 6th, particularly like violent people. Like we've seen the sob stories of like the grandmas or whatever, who I had no criminal record and now I have an ankle bracelet and I'm stuck on house arrest in my big fancy expensive barn, who it turns out they were throwing rocks at police officers and stuff or carrying weapons and brandishing them against people. Like I don't want to see those people pardoned. But the other people who are nonviolent and especially who weren't involved with the initial violence that breached the barriers of the Capitol in the first place, like, let them go. Especially since many of them have been in jail for years, and there have been allegations that they've been mistreated and given some subpar jail conditions as well.